and proudly proclaim. First to fight for the right and to build the nation's might, and the army goes rolling along. Proud of all we have done, fighting till the battle's won, and the army goes rolling along. And it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Count off the cages loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along. March along, sing a song with the army of the free. Count the brave, count the true, who have fought to victory. We're the army and proud of our name. We're the army and proudly proclaim. First to fight for the right and to build the nation's might, and the army goes rolling along. Proud of all we have done, fighting till the battle's won, and the army goes rolling along. And it's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Count off the cages loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the
Oh, here we go. I love that song. That's the Army theme song. And I just want to make me want to get up and march all around the room. Maybe I did a little bit. I don't know. How are you guys doing this evening? Welcome to our live review for Unit 7B, which is the second half of APUSH Period 7. We're going to cover 1929 until 1945. Essentially what we're doing is we're going to be going through the Great Depression, our reaction to it, which was the New Deal, and then of course going into the into World War II. Now, we got our exam tomorrow, but this is just a great review, just to wrap up this 9 weeks, this quarter, and get ready for spring break. Now, I know you guys are all excited for spring break, but we got to get through this test first. So we're going to get right here into a few minutes. I got Miss Behovich. She is there on the chat with us. And if you have any questions, you can post them there, and we'll answer them as quick as we can. I don't think we'll be here too long unless I just keep talking. So I'm just going to get my PowerPoint set up, which I forgot to set up. So give me half a second here. Talk amongst yourself. What's your favorite military song? Put it in the chat. So there it is. All right, from current slide. Now you're going to notice I got the big ideas, and I am actually starting with big idea number 7. I'm just going to come up here in just a second. Maybe not. Let me reset this. See, I thought I had it all planned. I thought it was going to be a nice, smooth transition, and it didn't happen. There we go. All right, big idea number 7. Of course, military songs. Off we go into the wild blue yonder, Anchors Away, the one I was just playing, All right, anyway. So now, see, I got distracted again. But anyway, I'm starting with big idea number 7 because this is a continuation of time period 7. So for the first half, we did big ideas 1 through 6. This one, we're going to do big ideas 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So we are going to start with the Great Depression, which caused policymakers to transform the United States into a limited welfare state with the New Deal, and then further define the goals of modern American liberalism. So what's going to happen coming out of the 1920s? We were living large in the 1920s, and prosperity was running pretty rampant. But what's going to happen is we're going to hit an economic brick wall in 1929. In fact, we typically use October 29th, 1929 as the, quote, start of the Great Depression, because that was Black Tuesday. That's when we saw the stock market crash. But what we got to understand, first of all, is what caused the market to crash. What caused this Great Depression? And there were a lot of factors that led to it, and all of these factors played a role. And as I've explained before, you could pick any one of these economic factors and it would cause an economic ripple, but it wouldn't cause an economic collapse. And what we experienced in the 1930s was a collapse. We saw things like shaky banking practices, overextending credit to people, dropping land values is another cause of the Great Depression. But if you really want to get right down to it, let's start looking at like the farmers. I always say, if you want a indication of what's going to happen in the economy soon, look at what's going on in the lives of the farmers. The farmers went through the 1920s and they had overproduced themselves into a severe level of debt. And overproduction, or that surplus that they were creating, was in existence because we also had high tariffs at the time. And as you know, high tariffs prevent trade. And so our farmers are producing at record rates, yet they have no one to sell their goods to. So that's going to cause them to go into heavy debt. On top of that, because of the prosperity of the 1920s, you're going to start seeing our stock market and the stocks being sold being overvalued. So the prices are going to be inflated. What's happening is people are buying stocks and they are making money, but that drives more people to buy and more people to buy. And the more people that are buying stocks, the higher the value of the stock goes. And what happens is all that purchasing overvalued the stocks we had. And then what people are doing is what's called buying on the margin, where they're essentially taking out loans to buy stocks. And sometimes it worked. You know, sometimes you could take out those loans and you could buy stocks and then they'd go up and you could sell them, pay off the loan and have a profit. But the question is, what happens when the stocks fall? And that's what's going to happen in October of 1929. We had overvalued the market so much that it just reached a breaking point and everything just dropped out and the values of stocks just plummeted. And you had all these people who had bought on the margin. It's also, speculation, same idea. And now they lost everything they invested, plus they still owe massive debt on those stocks they purchased. So that's going to drive a lot of people into economic ruin. And as a result of this high debt that's going to occur, a lot of people are going to start foreclosing on their homes. And when banks start foreclosing, then then they're not sustainable, and the banks are going to start closing as well. And as I pointed out numerous times, and I know it's a very simplistic model, but when people can't pay off their loans, banks don't make money. When banks aren't able to make money, they're going to start pulling in all the loans they have, essentially calling in those loans. That's going to drive a lot of people into foreclosure because they just don't have the money to pay off their loans. At the same time, banks not being able to sustain their business because their loans aren't going to be paid off, shut their doors. When they shut their doors in 1929, if you had any money in those banks, it's gone. There's nothing to protect your deposits. And so now you've lost all your money. Now the bank is closed. If you were a business and you had your money in that bank, now you're closing your doors, which means all your employees lose their jobs. And when they lose their jobs, they can't pay back loans. More banks close. And we just start this cyclical effect that is very difficult to recover from. And the fact, that our stock market was crashing as well. Like I said, we went into economic ruin going into the 1930s. The president at the time was Herbert Hoover, and he came in and he had this laissez-faire attitude with regards to the government. He believed that the government should have minimal intervention in the economy, and that's how we had always operated before, that the government stayed out of the common practices, the common routine of the economy. And so he maintained that, and it's not going to provide any relief at all. He does try to take some action, some steps to slow down the depression, and the one tool that the government does have, and they use quite often, is tariffs. and he's going to sign off on the Holly Smoot tariff, which is the largest tariff in history. Well, that just exasperates the problem because now tariffs drive down trade. Trade is what we need for the surplus of all the goods we have. More farms collapse. More loans cannot be paid back. More banks close. And like I said, it just gets worse and worse and worse. So that's going to lead us into the 1930s. And in 1932, there's going to be a new presidential election. And FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is going to run against Hoover. He's the opposition, and he's actually running on heavy government intervention. And he's actually also running on I'm not Hoover. So literally anybody could have run against Hoover, and they would have won. Now, FDR is going to push this idea of more government involvement. In fact, when FDR comes into office, the government is going to become more involved in the economics and the social systems of our country, more so than they have ever been in history. We're going to see the size of our government just explode, and it's going to become, massive during FDR's presidency. And he's essentially going to transfer our economy, or our government into a limited welfare state. And what that essentially means is the government is going to take the responsibility of maintaining and influencing our economy and the economic and social welfare of the American people. Never seen this before. I've told this story before. Prior to the Great Depression, Americans were not familiar with the government, meaning they didn't see the government in their daily lives. Well, that's all going to change during the 1930s. Roosevelt's going to come into office with a plan for attacking the Depression. It was called the New Deal. What's interesting about the New Deal is it wasn't a plan until the press created it as a plan. They said that FDR had this New Deal, and all of a sudden FDR's like, I got to figure out what this is. So he comes into office with this New Deal, and the crux of the New Deal is the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. So essentially what we're looking for is we want relief for the unemployed, we want recovery for the businesses in our country, and then we want reform in our economy so a depression like this would never happen again. And what Roosevelt's going to start doing is creating different agencies, different plans to start attacking these 3 R's. For example, for the first R, relief for the unemployed, you're going to see agencies like the PWA, the TVA, the CCC, the PWA, the Public Works Administration. That's jobs that are going to be created by the government for infrastructure, building roads and stuff like that. The TVA was also government funded to create electricity and water conservation in the Tennessee Valley. And then the CCC is a great example of another one, the Civilian Conservation Corps, where you're going to see the government hire men to come in and learn about soil conservation and forestry and stuff like that. A lot of these jobs, a lot of jobs that are being created, especially with the CCC, is that they're temporary jobs. But the idea is that Roosevelt wanted to get the American man working again, because if he's working again, even if it's temporary, even if it's for a couple dollars a day, it starts to build hope. And America in the early 1930s had lost hope. And that's what a lot of these programs in the relief section of the Triple R program was all about. Now, when we talk about recovery, look at the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act. What this is doing is this is looking at the relationship between workers and companies, and he's going to bring workers and companies together, unions such as that. They're going to come together, and they're going to start looking at ways to make conditions better. They're going to set, we're going to see our first minimum wage during this time, shorter hours, the 8-hour workday is going to become commonplace. And, unions are going to be given a little bit more legal freedom where, you're going to get rid of closed shops and stuff like that. So the NIRA is actually going to be part of that recovery for businesses. Now, part of the NIRA is going to be deemed to be unconstitutional. And I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But that was the crux of the recovery part, the recovery for business. Finally, there is the reform. We got to reform the economy so this doesn't happen again. So when we look at the reform, the first thing I want you to know about is the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act was looking at banking practices in the United States and looking at how the banks had failed. Now remember, and I didn't mention this, but you should remember for class, the first thing Roosevelt did when he took office was he set up a banking holiday where he shut all the banks in the country for 4 days. And he literally told the American people, when the doors of these banks reopen, the government is guaranteeing that they are strong enough and they will last and you're not going to lose your money. So start depositing your money. They're safe. It's safe to start using the banks again. And the Glass-Steagall Act is going to back this up because what it's going to introduce is FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And essentially, this is still in existence today. You see the little placards when you go into the bank. And what it essentially says is your deposits up to a certain amount will be safe. Even if this bank closes its doors an hour after you make your deposit, your money is still protected. When FDIC was first created, it was protected up to like $5,000. I think now it's protected up to like $500,000. But this was the federal government's way of saying it's safe to put your money back into banks. And they're thinking we got to get the banks up and running again because we need loans to start going out. Again, we need businesses to start ramping up again. We need to get the economy flowing again. Another part of the reform is going to be the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're going to oversee the business of the stock market. They're going to make sure this buying of the margin and speculation that unsafe loans are not going to be given out to borrow money to buy, stocks and stuff like that. And they're going to make sure there's no, insider trading going on and everything like that. They're going to regulate how the stock market runs. And then finally, and this is actually in the second part of FDR's New Deal. He had the first New Deal, the second New Deal, but you can kind of lump them together. That's okay. The second part of the New Deal, the big legislation that was passed, is the Social Security Act. Social Security Act of 1935 is going to create a pension for older Americans going forward. So this is how he jumped in, and again, he's essentially doing. He's creating this limited welfare state in order to regulate or to bring our economy back together. And what this is also going to do is define the goals of modern liberalism going forward. Now, not everybody was happy with the New Deal. There was people on both sides of the aisle that had complaints. On the liberal side, they were arguing that the New Deal did way too much for businesses, that, they should pull back and focus more on the worker. Whereas the conservative side, they said there's just way too much overreach of the federal government. They're gaining way too much power. And there are going to be challenges to some of the laws that are passed during this time period. I mentioned how, under the NIRA, that the NRA, the National Recovery Act, which was under the heading of the NRA, and also the Agricultural Adjustment Act, were both challenged at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled both of those programs unconstitutional. This is going to tick off Roosevelt to the point where he tries to get Congress to pass the Judicial Reorganization Act, also known as the court packing scheme, where he was going to try to add more justices to the Supreme Court. The strategy was he was going to add a justice for every justice who was over 70 years old at the time. What that would have meant was that 6 new Supreme Court justices would be added to the Supreme Court to take it to 15 total. Well, Congress is going to vote that down, but, it just shows, this conversation about court packing, it's nothing new in today's world. It's something that comes up every time one side loses a major decision in the court. But we're moving on. That's later in life that we're going to talk about. We're still in the 1930s. So let's get to big idea number 2, or big idea number 8, that says, before entering the war, let me fix this right here. Before entering World War II, the U.S. publicly maintained its traditional isolation while simultaneously aiding the Allied efforts. But the U.S. entered the war after, or quickly entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So let's get into this and let's look at what's going on we're essentially going to look at our interwar policy. So what was going on in the United States after World War I and before World War II. And essentially what we were practicing was isolationism. Now, Harding, when Harding was elected in 1920, he promised the United States a return to normalcy. And that return to normalcy is going to be standing on this idea of isolationism, staying out of the drama of the world. We have these two oceans on either side of us. They're the buffer between us and the rest of the world, and we can just stay away from all that craziness out there. Couple of examples of isolationism that you will hear about is, number one is those tariffs again. Believe it or not, tariffs added to or tariffs allowed us to remain isolated. Now, before we had the Hawley-Smoot tariff, we had the Fordney-McCumber Act, which was essentially a larger tariff that drove down trade. And then you had the Hawley-Smoot Act, which drove down trade. And the less we're trading, the less we're involved in the war in the world. Now, obviously, you can see the downside of that, but it's still an example of isolationism. Another one is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was signed by 62 or 63 countries in the world that essentially said war is illegal. And when we signed that, I mean, it wasn't regulated by the League of Nations, so there was no enforcement of this, but this is what we're carrying with us into the 1930s. As we go into the 1930s, though, the face of the world is changing. We're starting to see this rise of fascism and this rise of totalitarian governments in Europe, such as Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito and others. And there are some Americans who are saying, hey, what's going on over there? And, how are we going to respond? Now, most Americans, you stay out of it. Just stay out of it. But we do see these leaders becoming more and more aggressive. I mean, when I talk about aggressive, it starts with Japan invading China or invading Manchuria in 1931, and then Hitler remilitarizing the Rhineland, and then Hitler going into Austria in 1937, and then Hitler going into the Sudetenland in 1938, and then following into Czechoslovakia, and then Italy's going into Ethiopia, and you can kind of see this aggressive behavior of people over in Europe. But the United States wanted to stay out. Well, why did we stay out? Or, what was driving this reason? We were arguing for isolationism because of how we viewed World War I. And how we viewed it was based on a committee called the Nye Committee. And the Nye Committee basically made the ruling or made the assumption that the reason why the United States got involved in World War I was because of munition sales and loans to foreign countries. And so these munitions makers and these bankers, they referred to them as the merchants of death. They said it's because of that we got involved in World War I. And we're going to do everything we possibly can differently so that doesn't happen here. So that's when Congress is going to pass the Neutrality Acts in 35, 36, and 37. And we're going to look at everything we did going into World War I and make a law to say we can't do it going forward. So we can't loan money to countries at war. We can't sell munitions to countries at war. Americans don't get on ships under a foreign flag of a country that's at war. And that's what we did. These neutrality acts were set up to keep us out of the war. But war was coming. In fact, in 1939, Hitler is going to invade Poland. And essentially, this is going to be the start of World War II. But we're not going to get involved. Kind of. You see, you have a bunch of different viewpoints over here. You have the isolationists who say completely stay out of the war, stay neutral. But then you also have the interventionists who are arguing that we can't stay out of the war. And this idea that the Atlantic Ocean is keeping us safe from the war is just a myth. Because with the invention of submarines, with the evolution and the continued technology of air travel, that we can be hit at any time, and we need to be prepared for that. And in all honesty, by 1940, all we have between us and these radical fascists who are rising up in Europe is just us. That Britain is the only thing that stands in the way. And should Britain fall, we're in trouble. And there's no hiding the fact that FDR supported Great Britain. He's trying to toe that line of staying neutral, but also helping our ally over there. And that's when you're going to see several things being done by the Congress to help Great Britain in their fight against the Axis powers. The first one is going to be cash and carry. We can't trade with these belligerent countries and stuff like that. We can't afford to send our ships out into the sea because remember, World War I, our ships were being attacked by U-boats. And so we just don't want to send our ships out there anymore. We don't have the freedom of the seas and stuff like that. So the cash and carry basically tells you if you have the cash and you have a way to transport your goods, come on over to America and we'll supply all you need. And cash and carry it essentially loosened the Neutrality Acts a little bit. The next one is going to be the destroyers for bases, because as Great Britain keeps fighting, they don't have any money because it's all going to the fight in Europe. So what we do is we trade. We trade our U.S. naval destroyers, are these ships, and we trade them for British land holdings throughout the Caribbean. And so that's how we kind of get around the Neutrality Acts that way. And then finally, the big one is the Lend-Lease Act, where we're just going to start leasing military goods to Great Britain to help them fight this war. And so this is how we tried to stay out of it. This was our policy between the two wars, is to try to remain neutral, but still help our friend Great Britain, because Great Britain is pretty much going this alone over in Europe. Then everything changed. December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. We had our issues with Japan. The reasons why they bombed us, were several. I mean, we had cut off trade with them because we didn't like what they were doing over in China. So we cut off trade with them. And one of the major things we were trading with them was oil. They depended on us for oil. And so when we cut that off, that's going to kind of defeat the dreams of them building this industrial empire. We had frozen all their assets here in America. They had invested in American banks and stuff. We froze all their funds and stuff like that. And Japan was sitting in a place where they said we either need to pull back on our aggression, which they don't want to do because they're trying to build their own empire over in Asia, or we deal with that sleeping giant over in the Western Hemisphere, and that's the United States. And so they're going to decide that they're going to attack Pearl Harbor. Once they attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, got to know that date, put a star beside it, December 7th, 1941, we immediately enter the war. Now, if you compare this to going into World War I, if you remember, when we went into World War I, there were several steps and over several years that led us into joining that war. Some aggressive behavior towards us, whether it be the sinking of the Lusitania and then the U-boats and their activity in the Atlantic Ocean, and then finally the Zimmermann telegram, where Germany tried to get Mexico to take us to war. That's what led us going into World War I. World War II, it's going to be the attack on Pearl Harbor. We declare war on Japan. And Japan, being a member of the Axis powers, their friends, Germany and Italy, are going to declare war on us. And now we are in the war. And no, FDR did not declare war. Congress declared war, Ms. Pahovich. I know you meant to type that, and I just got to give you a hard time. So anyway, here we go. Big idea number 9. She's going to get me for that one. Big idea number 9. The required mobilization for U.S. entry into World War I transformed the American society economically while creating the occasion for the violations of civil liberties. What we're going to do here is I'm going to explain to you how and why our participation in this war completely transformed our economy. Excuse me just a second. Here we go. Cottonmouth. All right, let's get ready. So that's what this is all about. This is let's get ready to go to war. World War I changed us, like, or transformed our society as well. We'd been through this once before. And in World War One, we went into what's called total war, where we leveraged all our assets, both our domestic assets, our military assets. We just leveraged everything in order to fight the war. We're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to leverage everything in society focused on fighting World War II. And what you're going to see right away is federal spending was huge. It just ballooned going into this war, and we're going to start mobilizing everything. And this increase in federal spending is going to increase our gross domestic product, and that's how we measure our economy. And so our GDP is going to go up, and that's essentially going to pull us out of the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt created this New Deal, and it was set up to pull us out of the Great Depression. But by 1940, we were still fighting with high unemployment. We still didn't have, we still weren't at, full production in our factories and everything like that. But this war starting off, we had plenty of jobs now because all the factories are starting to boom. We had the draft, so we have millions of men going into the military. So we're going to see unemployment plummet down, but federal spending plummet up. We actually went from high levels of unemployment. I think in 1940, we were right around 19-20%. So we went from the highs of the high of unemployment to we actually became underemployed, where we had a labor shortage in the world, or in the country, because all our men were going to fight. When that labor shortage started, that's when the government's going to make a strong effort to bring women into the workforce, to bring women into the factories. And that's where we get Rosie the Riveter. That was part of the marketing campaign to get women to start coming and working in the factories, which was, initially a tough sell because women were often discouraged from doing industrial work, especially middle and higher class women and stuff. And so now they're going to be pushing for women to come and work in the factories as well. And the women are going to step up, and they're going to start serving, and they're going to work in the factories. And, if they're not working in the factories, they're volunteering at the Red Cross or the USO, or they're planting victory gardens. We're going to see a lot of the same similarities of World War One propaganda in World War II. I mean, just kind of change the names and change the date, and the same posters work. And so that's what we started doing again going into World War II. Now, we also, minorities play a huge role in World War II. African Americans, over 1 million African Americans are going to serve in the Army. Now, they are still serving in segregated troops. We are still segregated in the U.S. Army. However, in World War II, African Americans are allowed to serve in combat units. That's different than what we experienced in World War I. So when you're comparing the two, there's a major difference right there. But African Americans, though, are going to use World War I as a launch pad for a civil rights movement, because they're going to start what's called the WWII program. The NAACP is going to create this program, and the WWII program meant victory at home and victory abroad. We're going to go and fight. African Americans, we're going to go fight for America, fight for democracy in Europe. But we're going to come home and we're going to fight for civil rights. We want victory both in Europe and we want victory at home. So you're going to see, a lot of African American involvement in this war. In fact, you also see women who are, you're going to see FDR is going to pass Executive Order 8802, I believe is the number, which made it illegal for the defense industries to discriminate on their hiring practices based on race. So there are going to be some civil rights, progress during the war. And this is really going to be a big boost going into the 1950s. One of the major units, African-American units during World War II, is the Tuskegee Airmen, an African-American fighter pilot unit. Over 1,600 missions flown during this war. So, highly decorated and everything. Mexican Americans also played a role in this war. Over 300,000 Mexican Americans are going to fight in this war. But a lot of these men are coming from the agricultural sector in the West. And so what the government's going to do is they're going to pass what's called the Bracero program. And the Bracero program opens up America for other Mexican farm workers to come into the America to help with the harvest and the planting and stuff, and allows them to come in without having to deal with all those immigration laws, which is kind of fascinating because during the Great Depression, if you remember correctly, the government also passed the Repatriation Act, which sent a lot of Mexicans back to Mexico because we needed those jobs for Americans who were migrating for the Dust Bowl. So, it's kind of funny how it comes full circle. But when we talk about violations of civil liberties, we have to talk about the Japanese Americans and their relocation. Executive Order 9066. Put a star beside it. Remember it. This is where President Roosevelt signed off on Japanese American citizens being sent to being sent to relocation camps throughout the American West. They had to. Generally, they gave up their home, they gave up all their personal property, they had to give up their business, and they packed what they could in a suitcase and were sent to these relocation camps where they were held throughout the entirety of the war because we were very suspicious of them. Could they be spies? Could they be working for the Japanese government? And here's the thing. Did you hear me say Japanese Americans? These were American citizens being essentially arrested and put in these camps. Now, Fred Korematsu is going to challenge this. He's going to refuse to go to the camps. He's going to be arrested, and the ACLU is going to take his case. The American Civil Liberties Union is going to take his case, and he is going to sue the United States on the grounds that his Fifth Amendment rights have been violated. And just to remind you, your Fifth Amendment, it's what guarantees you that you're not going to be charged with a crime without due process, without being faced in a grand jury and stuff like that. Korematsu versus the United States. That's the case you need to know. So Korematsu v. U.S. That's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to rule that Executive Order 9066 is constitutional based on the threat of espionage, based on the threat that we are at war. And once again, the Supreme Court solidifies this idea that in times of war, your rights are not always guaranteed, that civil liberties take a back seat to what they consider national security. So you're going to see the violation of the rights of Japanese American citizens, yet the Supreme Court backs that up. So make sure you know that case, Korematsu versus the United States. All right. Next, here we go. Next topic. Big idea number 10. Once the U.S. committed to the war, the Americans saw the war as a fight for the survival of democracy and freedom against fascist totalitarianism. If you remember correctly, when we fought in World War I, we were fighting to make the world safe for democracy. When we go to fight in World War II, we're fighting in the world to save the world for democracy. So here we go. We're going to look at the causes and the effects of the victory of the United States and the Allies over the Axis powers. When we entered into the war, we were fighting, essentially, like I said, to save democracy and to destroy fascism, predominantly the Nazis. That's who we're going after. Now, when we initially entered the war, remember, we declared war against Japan. And so a lot of our focus was fighting in the Pacific. And unfortunately, we weren't doing too well in the beginning. Japan had the upper hand on us. But what you're going to find is very similar to World War I. In World War II, when Americans enter the war, it is going to tip the balance of favor towards the Allied powers. Now, initially, FDR said we're going to focus on the war in Europe first. We're still fighting in the Pacific, and I'm going to talk about a couple battles there in just a second, but our focus is going to be winning the war in Europe. And the reason why he did that is we had to make sure we got the Europe theater taken care of because we might need help from the Allies to defeat the Japanese in the Pacific theater. So the Soviet Union really wanted us to focus on Europe because they wanted the United States and Great Britain to create a second front to take some of the pressure off of what they're fighting over in the Soviet Union, because Germany has thrown all of its efforts behind taking down the Soviet Union. A second front would alleviate that. That's going to be discussed at the Tehran Conference in 1943. And it's at Tehran that they actually start to plan the D-Day invasion, the fight to liberate France from Nazi control. The planning of D-Day was about a year long, but the actual attack is going to happen on June 6th of 1944, and that's when we're going to start landing on the beaches of Normandy and France. Now, this is the largest amphibious raid in American history. We're coming from the seas and we're bringing everything we got. The first day we're going to land something like 200,000 or 300,000 men on the beaches of Normandy, and then over the next month or next few weeks, we're going to bring in 1 million American soldiers to fight to start to liberate Europe. Now, D-Day, don't get caught up that it was just a single-day battle. The Battle of Normandy is going to last nearly a month. I mean, actually, I think it might last closer to 6 weeks. But we do eventually liberate France. And once we liberate France, we start making our march towards Germany, towards Berlin. It's there that we have that Berlin or Germany throws its final major assault at us. It's called the Battle of the Bulge. And what Germany's going to try to do is create a wedge between the Allied armies in Belgium. And this, like I said, is going to be the last major effort of the Germans to try to stop the Allied advancement. But once we get rolling, you can't stop us. So by April 30th of 1945, that's a key, not a date you have to remember, but it's a key date because that's the day that Hitler realizes, dude, I've lost, and he takes his own life. 1 week later, we're going to have the surrender, and we have VE Day in Europe, victory in Europe. So essentially, America joins the war in the beginning of 1942. We actually did our first assault going into Africa and taking back Ethiopia. But really, it's going to be that invasion of Normandy in June of 44 that's going to send this wave of allies. Just picture this wave of allied powers coming across France and just crashing in on Germany. And that's essentially what happened. So, but now let's go over to the Pacific, because we are fighting in the Pacific as well. We're fighting the Japan over there. Now, two major battles that affected the fight in the Pacific is going to be the Battle of the Coral Sea and Battle of Midway. You don't need to know the details of the battle. What you need to know is between these two battles, the result is going to be that Japan is going to start retreating. America is now able to start pushing Japan back towards their home island. And what we use as we go through the Pacific is the Pacific is a strategy called island hopping, where we're going to go after smaller held islands, maybe not the major islands at the first that Japan's holding, but all these smaller ones, with the intent of gaining control as we go across the Pacific and disrupting the Japanese supply line. If we can be strategic in getting these different islands, then we can disrupt the supply line. And if you disrupt a supply line when a nation is at war, you pretty much render them helpless. That's kind of what happened to Germany when they went into the Soviet Union. Winter hit and they were so far away from behind the front lines, they couldn't get supplies up to the front line, which is going to weaken them. We do the same thing to Japan in the Pacific Ocean. Another major battle that's going to happen is Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is going to be one of those battles that, what is it, a turning point? I wouldn't call it a turning point, but what makes that so famous is you see the famous flag raising on the top of Mount Cerbiachi, and that has become the symbol of the American victory in the Pacific. Before we could claim victory in the Pacific, we wanted to have total surrender. Throughout the war, throughout the major conferences of the Big Three, whether it was the Tehran Conference, the Yalta Conference, or the Potsdam Conference, it was always about total surrender of the enemy. We had to have total surrender of Germany. Otherwise, that wouldn't be a victory. We also needed total surrender of Japan. And while President Truman, because President Roosevelt died in April of 1945, March of 1945. VE Day was in April of 1945. Later that year, in July and August of I'm getting all my May and June, I can't remember. But in the summer of 1945, you're going to have the Potsdam Conference. At that conference, you're going to have the big three, Churchill, Truman, and Stalin, meeting to discuss what they're going to do with Germany now that the war is coming to an end. And then right in the middle of the conference, Churchill gets voted out and David Attlee comes in. And, so what do we do with Germany? And then what happens in the Pacific? Stalin had promised that once the war in Europe's over, he would declare war on Japan. We don't know that we want to do that because we don't trust Stalin. Truman does not trust Stalin. In fact, Roosevelt had more trust for Stalin than Truman did. When they were at Yalta, they had divided up when they were at Yalta, they determined what was going to happen with Germany. And essentially what they determined to do was divide Germany into 4 zones. A zone controlled by the Soviets, one by the Americans, one by the English, and one by the French. The idea of creating these zones in Germany would be to help Germany rebuild and not create another Versailles situation. At Potsdam, Truman is concerned that if Stalin gets involved in the War of the Pacific, he's going to want the same kind of conditions in Japan, possibly China, and all these other places. So Truman really doesn't want Stalin involved in this war. Well, during the Potsdam Convention, Truman is going to be delivered a note that says the baby has been delivered. And what that tells Truman is that we have successfully tested the atomic bomb. It's then that Truman has this ace in his pocket. He realizes that we don't necessarily need Stalin, and we don't necessarily need to do a land invasion of Japan, because if we had to do a land invasion of Japan, that could have resulted in over 1 million casualties for the United States. That's not going to be the situation now. Truman decides to use the atomic bomb. And he, offers tells the Japan, I have this weapon. It's going to destroy you. Surrender now. Japan says no. Truman goes to the American people and said, this is what we're doing. We dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. Major damage, devastating damage, thinking that Japan's going to surrender now. They don't. So 3 days later, we drop our second bomb on Nagasaki. When that happened, that's when Japan finally surrenders. Between these two bombs, we're going to see over 140,000 people killed. Most of them on the initial blast. The rest of them because of major burns and radiation and stuff like that. So, we've now entered into the atomic age. But what happens is we see the end of World War II. VJ Day happens, I think, on September 8th, 1945, victory over Japan. And that's it. And so now we're entering into a whole new world. And that takes me to my very last bullet point, my very last big idea number 11, that says the war-ravaged condition of Asia and Europe and the dominant U.S. role in the Allied victory and post-war peace settlements allow the United States to emerge from the war as the most powerful nation on earth. Yeah, America. Gotta love it. I'm not going to go super in depth on this because a lot of this we're going to cover when we go into time period 8. But coming out of the war, the United States had become the predominant world power. You got to remember, industrially, we were far ahead of all these other European countries, primarily because we weren't fighting here in America. When the war came to an end, everyone else was rebuilding. We were golden. So we were able to go right back into consumer production and stuff like that. Prior to the war, we were the main supplier of weapons for the Allied powers. That builds our power in the country. And as we go into, this next time period, we're going to have to deal with Stalin, because he's going to essentially break his word that he gave us at Yalta, where he was going to allow, democratic elections in all of those German occupied territories, and he's going to move in, and communism is going to become the new threat of the world. And so the United States, because we're able to go into consumerism, because we're out of the Great Depression, we're going to try to help rebuild Europe with the intent of stopping communism from spreading. And like I said, we're going to cover all of that in period 8 when we get there. But essentially, I think the biggest outcome that you should take away with tonight with World War II is the creation of the United Nations and the Security Council of the United Nations. The United Nations basically created on the back of the League of Nations. We used the same general plan. The only difference was the United Nations has a little bit more infrastructure to start enforcing some of the rulings that they make. They have their own global security force and stuff like that. But the big thing is, coming out of World War II, the Security Council is going to be formed under the United Nations. And the Security Council is going to have 5 permanent members. The same 5 permanent members they have today. That's the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and Russia. The 5 main powers, the allied powers of World War II. Why this is so important, why being a permanent member of the Security Council is so important, is each of these countries has veto power in the United Nations. Every single international problem that happens in the world goes across the table of the Security Council, and how the UN responds to that can be vetoed by any one of those 5 countries. And it's a power. It's a very powerful thing that they're holding in their hands. And so this is at Yalta, when they were talking about the United Nations, Stalin was kind of like, I don't think I want to get involved. And they're like, ooh, Security Council, veto power. And he's like, ooh, power, I'm in. And so that's going to be the big takeaway from World War II. So like I said, the 2 big ones, the United States becomes the most powerful nation on earth. And when it comes to these post-war peace settlements, which we'll talk about more in the next unit, but the United Nations is going to be the big one on the table. Okay? All right, guys, there we go. That's where we are as far as the end of period 2. And you know what? I'm just going to tell you, all my students in class today, where I said I can do this under an hour, and they just said, well, that's what you said last time, Lennox. Guess what? Under an hour. I did it. I did this in, 50 minutes. Look at that. So not too bad. So we got some questions. If we have any questions I can answer that for you guys, or Ms. Fahovich could. What do we got? Anything else you want to talk about while we're here? Because I'm here. I got extra time. So. Not seeing anything. All right, I don't see anything coming up. Oh, is there a song playing? Oh, I'm sorry. Here, let me pause this. I'm sorry. Hang on, let me change this. There we go. Can you guys hear me now? All right. So, Clone, you didn't miss 10 big ideas. You only I started with big idea number 7. And that's a continuation of period 7. I'm seeing all the muted come in here. I'm going to give you here a second. Here it comes. Now, come on, it's coming. There's a delay. Can you hear me now? There we go. Okay. So, what I was saying, is that, like I said, we started with big idea number 7, and we went 7, 8, 9, and 10, or, so that's where we started. So, no, you did not sleep through 10 big ideas. Why do you need to watch Heimler? I just told you everything you need to know to get ready for the test tomorrow. I did get my hair hacked. Yes, I did. And it's not doing well with the humidity right now. So don't judge. Don't judge. This is just going to be on, Did I get hacked? I didn't get hacked. No. I misunderstood the question. The Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus the United States, absolutely. That's going to be when Fred Korematsu is going to sue the United States for violating his Fifth Amendment rights, which basically said that he had that because of the Japanese internment camps, that they had falsely arrested him. And so he's going to take that all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to rule that Executive Order 9066, the executive order that sent all the Japanese Americans to the internment camps, that was a constitutional move because we were at war. And during war, our civil liberties aren't guaranteed. So Korematsu versus the United States once again reaffirms that during wartime, our civil liberties can be taken away under the view that the government is protecting us under national security. So yeah, I'm going to show you the puppies. Don't worry about that. So yeah, clone. I'm sorry. The music I had on a different image here. When I go through I have several different camera angles on here through my OBS system, and I had the music turned on one, and I thought I had that one. Jack, I swear you guys just come to see the dogs. Seriously. Kind of hurts my feelings. All right, yeah. Okay, so. All right, any other questions that we can answer for you guys? This is a good, nice quick one tonight. All right, I guess I'll get the dogs up here. Do you want to come say hello, Flynn? You want to get up here? Come here. Get up here. Flynn's right here. Flynn's been down at my feet this whole time, so hang on. Well, Carter, you just come on to show everybody what you know. All right, come here. Up. Oh, they're both here. Goodness. All right, Gilligan, here, sit. Here we go. All right. Let's say hi to Gilligan first. Come here, buddy. All right, here comes Gilligan. Get the screen down. There's Gilligan. There he is. Say hi, Gilligan. Hi. See, Gilligan. Yes, Gilligan. Okay, Jacqueline, I'll let you get away. And here comes Flynn. So let me see if I can get Flynn in here. Gilligan now. Gilligan's like saying, "This is my spot now." So, all right. So here we go. Okay, Gilligan's going off. Here comes Flynn. Got his bear. So he's happy. He thinks we're gonna play now. We probably will. We'll probably step out and so Hoover's presidency, Arnold. Essentially, I would say what I'd focus on with Hoover is that he didn't do anything. He did try to, the Reconstruction Finance Corps. He tried to do something like that. But really, Hoover's whole thing was he wanted, to continue that idea of a minimal government intervention. That's what we pretty much always had. And he believed that if the government just took a step back, the economy would recover on its own. The problem was we were so deep into this economic collapse that it wasn't recovering like we had seen before, like when we had the Panic of 1893 or the Panic of 73. The economy did eventually recover without government intervention. Was a completely different animal. So when you look at Hoover, his inaction is probably the biggest thing you should remember, but he did also sign off on the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which is one of the largest tariffs we have in history. I think it was like a 60% tariff, and that's going to cut trade back. Now, he did it to try to get industry to come back, but because of all the surpluses we had in the 1920s, we're still stuck with these surpluses. We can't sell them now because we don't have trade. So that's how I would look at it for that. Hoover, I think Hoover, unfortunately, just got elected at the wrong time. They say in life, timing is everything. Hoover had very bad timing. with regards to this. He had served in the government throughout the 1920s. He had served during World War I. He had, ran the Food Administration and the wartime production and all that other stuff. So, he just was a horrible president, and that's, kind of a shame. So, yeah, laissez-faire, absolutely. That's what I meant by lack of government information. And when we say laissez-faire, you got to be careful, because coming out of the Gilded Age, it's not the same laissez-faire that we had during the Gilded Age. He believed in government regulation, but like Coolidge, he believed in regulation, but allowing businesses to run. As long as they were following the rules, everything was fine. So the government just needed to stay out of the way. I might bring him to school the day of the exam. We'll see what happens. So no promises, though. Every time I put him in my car, it takes me an hour to vacuum out my car of all the dog hair. So, all right. I don't see any more questions. Yeah. All right. Remember the key, guys, with your SAQs tomorrow? Evidence. You've got to have evidence. You've got to talk the talk and walk the walk. Don't just talk history like you're talking to someone, that doesn't know anything. You have to give evidence. Just like when you go into the courts, the lawyers are going to say, I need evidence of what you're trying to prove. That's what we need to see in your SAQs. So name names, battles, presidents, laws, Supreme Court cases, events. Let me see those names in your SAQ answers. You can follow ACE or you can follow T. But, do one of them. Have some structure. Okay? Alrighty, my friends. It's been a pleasure. I thank you for your attention. The boys say thank you. Flynn is saying, see you later. He's back. Oh, big smile. There we go. All right, guys. We're going to say goodnight, and we will see you tomorrow. Spring break, 2 days away. Peace out.